Alright, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome back. It's me, Addy, again, and I hope you guys are doing amazing as always. So, today I'm back with yet another mini review video of the latest game we experienced within Square Enix's Final Fantasy franchise. As a quick recap if you're new around here, I've been doing a marathon over on Twitch of all the pixel remasters of the single player games that I haven't played before in the series, and that includes all 6 of the first games. So far, I've reviewed the first 3 games, and that said, I want to give you guys a big thank you for over 1,000 views on the Final Fantasy III video. That was wholly unexpected, and I really do appreciate you all for checking it out. Thank you so much. And now, just this last week, I completed Final Fantasy IV as well. So as usual, let's dive right on into the mini review of this one. Final Fantasy IV is one of the 2 games amongst the first 6 Nintendo era titles that I'd heard the most buzz around. The other one was Final Fantasy VI. These 2 games, from my understanding, were universally lauded, with many calling them some of the greatest and most influential games of all time. I'd heard vaguely of its cast of characters and the kind of world that it was set in. Granted, it may have helped that I'd played all of 20 minutes of this game around 17 years ago on my Game Boy Advance, but still, my primary source of knowledge when it came to this game was the love that people had for it. And having now completed it, I fully understand why. Final Fantasy IV is a game that, much like others, I ended up adoring. One of the chief reasons for why Final Fantasy VII is not only my favorite game within this franchise, but also my favorite game ever made, is because of one of its core messages that is relayed through its main character, Cloud. And that is the fact that you don't need to be someone special to do something special. In a similar vein, Final Fantasy IV's lead hero, Cecil, also represents a powerful resonant message. That one being the fact that your past doesn't define you. If you so desire, today could be the first day of the rest of your life. And this ended up being true for Final Fantasy IV in and of itself, for the game would end up changing the series forever. I'd imagine that back in 1991 when this game came out as Final Fantasy II in North America, that many from the West would have been shocked by the leap in quality from the first game to this. Of course, that would in large part have been due to the fact that America would be missing 2 whole games in between Final Fantasy I and IV, each with their own unique strengths that would strongly contribute to Final Fantasy IV's DNA. By utilizing the hardware of the Super Famicom, which was new at the time, and by combining the elemental crystals, emphasis on story, and the varied jobs of the first 3 games respectively, Square's work on Final Fantasy IV would culminate in an experience that paid homage to its predecessors, whilst making up for one big shortcoming they all shared: a lack of drama and intrigue to the world and characters. And this was executed in a way that is recognizable across every subsequent game in the franchise to this day. Final Fantasy IV established the concept of the dramatic interpersonal stories that we all know and love from these games. When you think about your favorite Final Fantasy title, it's likely that the first thing that comes to mind is the party or a group of characters traveling together. Their conflicts, the way they come together, and their collective effort to overcome a world-threatening crisis are often what stand out the most. This staple element is what we have Final Fantasy IV to thank for. While the first 3 games did dabble in this, Final Fantasy IV is the one that took it to the next level. Similar to the first game in the franchise, Final Fantasy IV is set in a medieval high fantasy world where elemental crystals are dispersed throughout the land. And drawing on the dark, oppressive atmosphere of Final Fantasy II, it portrays its antagonists as ruthless villains who are willing to shed blood to seize the crystals and their power. With a perfect combination for an intriguing world, the game then injects proper characters and, by extension, a dramatic story into the experience. And the icing here that hit all the right notes for me were the unique gameplay classes, or jobs, for the major characters in the story, all of which influenced their thoughts, personalities, and relationships in an incredibly imaginative and compelling way. In the beginning of the story, you're introduced to a Dark Knight and Dragoon, my 2 absolute favorite classes in the Final Fantasy franchise. Cecil, who I briefly mentioned earlier, is the Dark Knight in question, and once again is the main character of the story. Employed by the Kingdom of Baron to command a fleet of airships, Cecil is introduced to us as a man with a haunting past. Due to his lot as a Dark Knight, he's committed terrible atrocities in the name of the kingdom he's sworn to serve, with his most recent foray against the peaceful town of Mysidia, where he and his men slaughtered innocents to acquire their crystal. At the beginning of the game, Cecil is plagued by guilt, and this is what drives his character to ultimately question his king's motives, leading him to be demoted and sent along with his friend Kain, the Dragoon, on a mission that changes their fate forever. And as Cecil journeys through the world, he forges strong relationships that touch on friendship, betrayal, and enmity with both his foes and allies, some of whom make way for truly memorable plot twists. Now, of course, I won't go into spoilers in this video, but what I will tell you is that this adventure is great, and that for Square's first crack at telling a proper story with fleshed out characters, they absolutely knocked it out of the park here. Just the incredibly creative and subversive concept on its own of having a Dark Knight be this complex character who's tired of sinning and wants to change his ways should be enough to tell you that this is going to be something special. And it is. Cecil's character development over the course of the story is hands down the best part of the game, no doubt. And I'd be lying to you if I said that he didn't quickly become one of my favorite protagonists within this series. There's a pivotal moment not too far into the game that perfectly encapsulates that. And if you've played it, then you absolutely know what I'm talking about. It is one of the greatest moments in gaming. And it not only serves to evolve its main protagonist, but it also intertwines the job system with the story in a brilliant way. So, let's talk more about the jobs. Final Fantasy IV's spin on it is very interesting to say the least. Since it's a story-driven game where the jobs influence the characters in a narrative sense, it doesn't allow the player to switch the jobs, unlike in Final Fantasy III where that was the bread and butter of the game. Instead, here in Final Fantasy IV, different jobs are experienced by the player via unique characters joining and leaving the party as dictated by the story. And since the game very clearly wants to boast a good variety of jobs like in its predecessor, it features a multitude of these characters who come and go. So you can think of this system as combining the variety of Final Fantasy III's jobs with the guest system of Final Fantasy II. And to touch on the latter a bit more, it really does feel like, with the exception of Cecil, who is always in your party, everyone else is a guest. You never truly get a sense of permanence or who the main players are supposed to be besides him, arguably until the final act of the game. But that by no means is a bad thing. I like that this is just another one of those unique elements you'll find in a Final Fantasy game that gives it its unique identity. Another great example of what I'm talking about here is the fact that you can have up to 5 members in your party at a time, making this the first Final Fantasy game that I've ever personally played that allows for more than 3 to 4 characters in combat. I don't know if there are other FFs out there that also allow for 5, and I'd be pleasantly surprised if there were, but going off of my experience with all the games that I've played so far, this is certainly a first for me, and a cool one at that. Another little unique thing here was how the battle order of your characters actually kinda mattered in this game. In most other Final Fantasies, I never bothered to change the order of my characters in the menu, which impacted how they lined up in combat. But in this game it sorta matters, since depending on where you've placed your character, they'll either be in the front or back row, which, as you may know, impacts how much damage they take and how much they deal. So I liked how this game for once encouraged me to mess around with that stuff. And the characters themselves all play out in a way that's really fun during the combat scenarios. This is the first Final Fantasy to introduce the famous ATB, or Active Time Battle system, which adds real-time urgency to turn-based fights, allowing for enemies to attack you if you take too long to act, and for your characters to attack the enemies once their time gauge is full. This was something else that surprised me. I had no idea that ATB was introduced as early as Final Fantasy IV, and I erroneously believed that this was just another element amongst the myriad of revolutionary concepts that Final Fantasy VII brought to the table. But no, this turned out to be yet another one of Final Fantasy IV's revolutionary concepts, right next to the dramatic storytelling that impacted the franchise forever. And in the same light, ATB would go on to influence just about every subsequent turn-based Final Fantasy. Alright, let's move on to the character abilities in Final Fantasy IV. Their abilities are just about what you'd expect from their respective jobs. Like, the Dragoon can jump, the White Mage can heal, the Ninja can throw shurikens, and more. But a nice surprise here is how you can make certain classes that are generally known for being physically weaker, like White Mages, particularly strong in that regard, since in this game, you can equip them with bows and powerful arrows. Now, I don't know about you guys, but it's not every day that you can make mages in these games bonk enemies with anything other than wooden sticks, so it felt good to finally be able to do so. And oh my goodness, it felt equally amazing, if not more so, to be able to actually replenish MP with ethers in this game, speaking of the mages. Now, if you've seen my Final Fantasy III review, you'll know just how much I griped about the lack of ethers in that game and the unnecessary stress that caused. This game does not have that problem whatsoever. I never felt pressure to escape dungeons or back out of battles because of a lack of MP, especially due to the inclusion of special resting zones within dungeons that would allow me to set up camp in order to fully restore my stats before delving deeper into them. And on that note, yes, the dungeon design was phenomenal in this game, improving upon almost everything about the way they were constructed in the previous titles. I had a good time exploring these dungeons, mainly because of all of the practical elements such as the aforementioned resting spots, as well as treasure chests that would almost always have something useful in store for me. And I really liked the level design of the overworld too. There was an impressive amount of optional areas to take on, many evolving modes of transport all stemming from the classic airship, and some really diverse and unique biomes, each with their own world map. Without getting into spoilers, this truly does feel like the first Final Fantasy to allow you to venture beyond just the Earth-like globe that you're typically limited to, and into the mystical unknowns. And it also struck me that this might have been the first Final Fantasy to actually combine elements of a different aesthetic with its predominant one. What I mean by that is, even though this is largely a medieval high fantasy Final Fantasy game, there are some elements of technology and futurism in this. And that's something you might notice about a lot of Final Fantasy games in general, the fact that they mix and match a lot of different genres and styles and that kind of thing. I like that. My one tiny criticism, however, for the level design stuff in this game would be for the dungeons. Even though I did say that for the most part, yeah, I did like them. In Final Fantasy IV, I didn't like how there were no cracks or visual cues in the walls to signify the presence of hidden tunnels. This was something I liked in Final Fantasy III, and it being gone in this one meant that I had to painstakingly walk into each wall tile at times in order to find where the tunnels were, which could get pretty annoying when compounded by random encounters in the process. But one cool thing that I did notice early on in the dungeons that doesn't really have anything to do with them, but that I noticed in a dungeon anyway, was how spell acquisition worked in this game. In Final Fantasy IV, you no longer have to painstakingly buy spells from vendors. Instead, you learn them as your characters level up. I really liked the system, as it added a satisfying layer of progression. It gave me more incentive to get into random encounters so that I could get more of these spells, some of which I couldn't actually even unlock since they'd become available to me in the story later on, and by extension could only be used during scripted battles. That's right, this game features several scripted or event battles in which you don't control your characters directly, and instead get to watch the outcomes and character actions unfold as per the game's story. While some of the previous titles did dabble in this, there were mostly just one or two of them in which your characters would get wiped by an insanely powerful foe. But this game featured those specific moments and more, many of which are actually really cool to see. My favorite one was where halfway through a battle, when it seemed like all hope had been lost, a character I hadn't seen for a while in my party swooped right back in and came to save the day with brand new abilities that I could use at my disposal. It was badass. In a similar vein, there are a lot of boss battles in this game that, while not entirely scripted, do feel like puzzle fights, if you will, where unless you figure out the correct combination of attacks or abilities, you will not win the fight. I had mixed feelings towards this since, on the one hand, it did spice things up, but on the other, there were times when the game didn't make it abundantly clear what it wanted me to do in these unique scenarios. Ultimately though, the way that the story informed the gameplay, and more specifically the combat in this experience, was wonderful. Okay, time for a semi-tangent. A second ago, I did mention a certain someone who swoops into battle to help you out during one of the semi-scripted fights. She actually reminded me a lot of a very similar character from Final Fantasy IX, which, in retrospect, at least to me, has some pretty subtle parallels with Final Fantasy IV here. And you know what? I loved seeing that since FF9 is my second favorite mainline game after 7. One of these parallels I want to point out had to do with the music. First off, in general, the soundtrack was amazing in Final Fantasy IV, and the fact that I could remember so many of the tracks so well from just 20 minutes of gameplay 17 years ago really speaks to the timeless nature of good music. But I want to bring up one track in particular that made me jam the heck out, whose simultaneously funky and badass vibe reminded me of the Black Mage Village theme from Final Fantasy IX. And the funny thing is, this in Final Fantasy IV was playing in a village that also predominantly had black mages. The track I'm of course talking about is the Mysidia theme. It was freaking awesome. Granted, this was the remastered version of the OG track, but still. Mr. Bopper, it's literally so much like the Black Mage Village theme from Final Fantasy IX. It radiates that same bopper banger energy, man. So good. Literally, that's how that one goes, right? It's so similar sounding. And the rest of the game, as we've clearly established, was nothing short of awesome too. And while I'd ultimately call it awesome, of course, no game is perfect, and Final Fantasy IV isn't exempt from that. One of the more noticeable problems with this game, at least to me, was how a lot of its more emotional moments would end up being undermined, specifically through a lot of fake-out character deaths. Like in Final Fantasy II, our recurring theme in this game is sacrifice, and throughout the experience, you witness characters you've grown attached to laying their lives down so that Cecil may carry on and save the world. However, it doesn't take long for you to discover that these very same characters end up being alive and well, completely undoing any impact that their sacrifice may have initially had. I found some of these instances to be quite disappointing, as they had initially set up the game to be far more mature than anything I'd experienced before, only to backpedal on it. And I do find it bizarre that a certain character, at a certain point, mentions their allies are too quick to throw their lives away, as if the game is making a point about how this is a gritty world plagued by the death of good people, when the writing doesn't even reflect that since it keeps bringing them back, for the most part. On top of this, there are some party members in this story who I wish were just fleshed out a bit better. Some of the cast is incredible, while some very clearly take the back seat or are forgotten about a little too quickly, with many even falling victim to an overuse of the amnesia trope, which did get a little old towards the end.
He got amnesia, yeah.
But in spite of all these issues, I'm ultimately very understanding since, of course, this was Square's first crack at a story of this scale. And when you consider what they ultimately accomplished here, it's really nothing short of astonishing. So, with all this said and done, Final Fantasy IV is a game that I ridiculously recommend. Listen, if you're looking to get into the Final Fantasy series and want to start somewhere that gives you a solid taste of what to expect with a majority of the titles down the line, then honestly, this would be a fantastic place to start. While Final Fantasy I is absolutely one of the most important games ever made, and I do encourage you folks to give it a run, along with 2 and 3, it being the genesis of the series means that it's ultimately a trial and error game. It is a game that walked so that Final Fantasy IV could run. Hironobu Sakaguchi, the creator of the series, as well as his talented team, clearly found their footing with Final Fantasy IV, as well as the confidence to expand upon the foundations they laid with it well into the future. And if I ended up liking this game so much, I cannot wait to eventually get the 6, which I hear is the zenith of all these old school 2D Nintendo titles. And I'm really excited to play 5 as well, which I've heard very little about. So, if you guys want to catch those playthroughs as they happen, stop by and say hi over on twitch.tv/irritableindian, where I'm streaming these games live. If you want to catch the VODs of my FF4 playthrough, as well as anything and everything else I've ever played, then do be sure to check out my second channel. That's Irritable Archives, also linked down below. Truth be told, I might take a break from this marathon for now since there are a bunch of game releases on the horizon that I do want to check out and stream, but rest assured, we will be back with this. Stay tuned. Thank you so much for watching, folks. You are the best. And never forget, today could be the very first day of the rest of your life. Keep on keeping on.